In the early hours of a bright morning, Alexander Monroe ended a bracing business call and pushed open the door to his marble-floored kitchen, expecting silence and order. But there, hidden in the corner behind gleaming counters, he glimpsed Charlotte Ross crouched low, hastily scraping leftovers from a discarded plate. She ate in whispered bites, as though the walls themselves might judge her. That moment, so small, so secret, shook something deep inside him. He froze, heart pounding, unable to tear his eyes away. He had everything: power, wealth, control. And yet here was someone forced to hide just to eat. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Alexander Monroe ended his serious business call, hung up, and allowed himself a deep breath. He stepped into his mansion's kitchen, the morning sun flooding tall windows, casting sharp reflections on polished marble floors. Every surface was spotless, every line immaculate, a world built on precision. As he took 2 steps forward, a faint rhythmic scrape echoed behind him, a fork against a plate. His brows creased. He paused, listening. He expected a chef, a cleaner, perhaps a staff member tidying. He turned toward the sound, his footsteps deliberate. As he rounded the counter, he stopped short. There, crouched behind the island bench, was Charlotte Ross, his maid. She held an old dinner plate, half-eaten. She ate quickly, glancing over her shoulder, her uniform wrinkled, her hands trembling. Alexander stood frozen, speechless, watching someone hide in shadow just to eat what others discarded. He quietly stepped back, heart hammering, unwilling to alert her. He retreated into the hallway, mind racing, disturbed, confused, ashamed. Behind him, Charlotte hastily hid the plate, wiped her lips, and resumed her duties as though nothing had happened. He lingered at the window, staring into the morning light, haunted by the image of her crouched figure in the corner. That night, Alexander Monroe lay in the dim hush of his bedroom, surrounded by the quiet luxury he had built for himself. Yet sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again. Charlotte Ross, crouched low behind the counter, eating in silence as though survival itself required secrecy. The image clung to him, an ache beneath his chest. Around him, the city outside glittered with lights, but none of them seemed to reach him. He rose from bed, restless, and sat at his desk. His fingers hovered over the surface of his tablet before he finally searched for her record in the household files. Charlotte Ross, 25, employed 8 months. No complaints, no absences, no requests. Her salary on paper was fair, yet something about those numbers now felt hollow. Fair to him, perhaps, but fair to her. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had built his life on logic, contracts, and precision. But in that moment, all his careful arithmetic felt meaningless. He turned off the screen and leaned his head against his hands. In the faint hum of the night, memory crept in uninvited. A different version of himself years ago, when he was just Alex from Detroit, sleeping on an air mattress in a one-room apartment, counting coins to buy instant noodles, whispering to himself that success would be worth the hunger. For the first time in years, he remembered that sharp emptiness, the gnawing taste of waiting for something better. And he frowned, realizing how far he'd drifted from that young man. Success had hardened him into someone who calculated everything except compassion. When dawn returned, Alexander rose earlier than usual. The air in the mansion felt colder, quieter. He walked toward the kitchen with purpose, not to reprimand or inspect, but to see. As he entered, Charlotte was already there, tidying counters, her movements careful and precise, her expression blank with exhaustion. The morning light caught the faint shadows under her eyes. He said nothing, only observed. Every gesture of hers was cautious, rehearsed. Then a sudden clatter. A spoon slipped from her hand and struck the floor. She flinched instantly, shoulders tense, breath caught in fear. That tiny motion, the instinctive brace for punishment, cut deeper than anything he'd expected. In that instant, Alexander understood this wasn't about food at all. It was about dignity, about the quiet, invisible battle of someone trying to exist without being noticed. He stood there for a few seconds longer, speechless, his throat tight with something he couldn't name. Then, without a word, he turned and left the room. The echo of the fallen spoon followed him down the hallway as his mind began to turn over a question that wouldn't let him rest. How many other people in his world were silently hiding their pain while he walked past without ever seeing them? By the next morning, the question had grown heavier in Alexander Monroe's mind. He couldn't focus on his business calls, couldn't even taste his morning coffee. Each time he tried to move on, he saw Charlotte Ross again, bent quietly behind the counter, afraid to be seen for simply being hungry. Finally, unable to silence the weight of it, he called for the head housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, a woman who had been with him for over 15 years and knew the pulse of every corner in his home. He asked about Charlotte, not as an employer, but as a man who needed to understand. Mrs. Turner hesitated at first, unsure why the question mattered, but when she finally spoke, her voice carried both admiration and sadness. Charlotte, she explained, sent nearly every dollar she earned back home to a small town in Louisiana. Her mother was sick, chronic illness, and her younger brother, barely 12, needed school fees and medication. "She barely eats herself, sir," Mrs. Turner said softly. "Sometimes we have to remind her to take a plate from the staff meal, but she always says she's fine." Alexander sat still, stunned. The truth hit harder than he expected. This wasn't negligence or desperation born from carelessness. This was sacrifice. Quiet, unseen, relentless sacrifice. That evening, as city lights began to blink awake outside, Charlotte sat on her narrow bed in the staff quarters, carefully folding her paycheck into an envelope. Her handwriting, neat but trembling, filled the page of a letter addressed to her mother. She wrote of hope, of health, of love, never of hunger. She pressed the envelope shut, tears gathering as she whispered, "Soon, Mama, soon." Her small lamp flickered, casting shadows across the room, and she took a long breath, as if willing herself to be strong again for another month. Across town, Alexander sat at a table in one of the city's finest restaurants. The waiter poured him vintage wine, set down a plate of seared steak, but as he lifted his fork, he paused. The taste of luxury, once a symbol of his success, now felt like ash in his mouth. Every bite brought back the image of Charlotte, crouched in the corner, eating leftovers in silence. The contrast was unbearable. The fork trembled in his hand before he finally set it down, appetite gone. For the first time, he felt the sting of guilt woven into privilege, the kind that didn't fade when the lights dimmed. He left the restaurant early, the city air sharp against his face as he drove back toward his mansion. The gates opened quietly, and he sat in his car for a long moment before stepping out. The mansion loomed ahead, beautiful but cold, every light calculated, every corner silent. He looked up at the windows, his windows, and realized that for all the success they symbolized, they had shut out more humanity than they had ever sheltered. Wealth, he thought, had made him comfortable, but empty. It had bought him security, but cost him sight. When he entered his study, the room felt different, not as grand, not as impressive. He sat down, pulled a sheet of paper toward him, and stared at the blank page. The clock ticked softly. Then, with slow, deliberate strokes, he began to write. Not an order, not a business memo, a promise. No one, he wrote, should have to hide to eat. The pen lingered over the words as a quiet calm settled in his chest. For the first time in years, Alexander Monroe wasn't writing a contract to protect his wealth. He was drafting the beginning of his own redemption. The next morning dawned softer than usual over the Monroe estate. The sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the mansion's grand dining hall, glinting off polished silver and marble. The staff stood together, uncertain, exchanging curious glances. None of them had ever been called to gather here before. Not in this room, not all together. At the head of the long mahogany table stood Alexander Monroe, his suit impeccable as always. But something in his eyes had changed. Gone was the distant businessman who spoke only through commands. Today his voice carried something gentler. He looked around the room, at Charlotte Ross, at the cooks, the cleaners, the gardeners, and said quietly, "From this day on there will be no separate meals, no leftovers, no hiding." The staff shifted uneasily, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Alexander continued, "We all work under the same roof, and we will all eat at the same table, together." For a moment there was only stunned silence. You could hear the clock ticking in the corner. Then soft murmurs began to ripple through the room. Disbelief, then gratitude. Some of the older staff exchanged emotional glances, while younger ones smiled timidly, afraid the kindness might be temporary. Charlotte stood near the end of the table, her hands clasped nervously. She didn't dare raise her eyes at first, afraid that if she did, she might cry. But when she finally looked up, Alexander's gaze met hers. He gave a faint, reassuring smile and said, just loud enough for her to hear, "No one should hide to eat." The words struck deep, not just for Charlotte, but for everyone listening. They weren't just a rule. They were an apology, a declaration, a change of heart. Moments later, the kitchen doors opened, and for the first time, the aroma of fresh breakfast filled the main hall, not just for the guests, but for everyone. Plates were set on the same long table, and Alexander gestured for the staff to sit. Hesitant at first, they slowly took their places, unsure if it was truly allowed. Then one of the cooks chuckled softly, another whispered thanks, and soon, laughter began to ripple across the room. Charlotte, still overwhelmed, sat quietly with her plate before her. She looked up again, and for the first time since she began working there, she saw Alexander not as a millionaire, but as a man, one trying to make things right. Soft piano music played as conversation filled the air. Stories were shared, smiles exchanged, and the walls that once felt so cold now echoed with warmth. Alexander stayed at the table longer than anyone expected, actually listening to their dreams, their families, their small triumphs and struggles. He realized how long it had been since he truly heard another person speak without calculation or formality. And as he listened, something inside him healed, something that wealth had buried long ago. As the meal ended, Charlotte turned to him with a gentle smile, eyes shimmering with quiet gratitude. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. That smile said everything. It was forgiveness, appreciation, and hope all at once. The camera lingers on Alexander's expression, thoughtful, softened, as morning light floods the room. For the first time in years, the Monroe mansion feels alive. Weeks passed since that morning when everything changed inside the Monroe mansion. The staff had grown closer, laughter had replaced whispers, and the heavy air of fear had turned into something warmer, something human. Yet amid that quiet transformation, Alexander Monroe carried a thought that never left him. The image of Charlotte Ross, hiding behind the counter, eating cold leftovers in silence. It haunted him still, not out of guilt alone, but out of an ache to make things right beyond words. One late afternoon, as the sun spilled through the tall windows of his study, Alexander called for Charlotte. She entered hesitantly, her hands clasped together, unsure why she'd been summoned. Her heart pounded as she stood before his grand oak desk where papers lay neatly stacked and a small white envelope rested on top. Alexander looked up from his chair, his tone calm and kind. "Charlotte," he said, "you've been with us for almost a year now. You've worked harder than anyone I've ever seen. Sit, please." She hesitated, glancing at the elegant chair opposite him as though it weren't meant for her. He gave a faint smile. "It's all right," he reassured. Slowly she sat down, her back straight, her breath shallow. He slid the envelope and a small folder toward her. "These," he said softly. Belong to you. Charlotte frowned, confused. Her trembling fingers opened the envelope first. Inside, a crisp letter bearing the seal of a local medical foundation. Her eyes scanned the words. Full medical sponsorship for Maria Ross. Complete care coverage effective immediately. Her hand flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. Sir, I don't understand, she stammered. Alexander leaned forward, his voice low and sincere. Your mother deserves care. And your brother, he said, tapping the folder. He deserves a future. Charlotte opened the folder to find admission papers, tuition receipts, and a scholarship confirmation from a nearby academy. Her brother's name, Samuel Ross, printed neatly across the top. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Tears streamed freely as she pressed a hand to her chest, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't accept this, she whispered. Alexander smiled faintly. You've given everything you have to others, Charlotte. Let someone help you now. The room fell into silence, except for her quiet sobs. She wept not out of sadness, but relief, the kind that comes when life finally shows you kindness after too many years of struggle. Cut to the following week. Charlotte's mother lying peacefully in a hospital bed, smiling weakly as doctors tend to her. A nurse adjusts her blanket, while Charlotte's brother Samuel walks proudly into his new school, books clutched tightly to his chest, eyes wide with hope. Back in the mansion, Charlotte writes a letter, her handwriting neat but emotional. To the man who taught me that compassion still exists in this world, she writes, you didn't just help my family. You restored our dignity. You showed me that wealth isn't in what you own, but in what you give. Meanwhile, Alexander's life quietly shifts. He begins spending less time at exclusive board meetings and more time visiting community shelters, not as a businessman, but as a volunteer. He donates food, funds, and resources, all anonymously. He doesn't want credit, he wants change. In the closing scene, Alexander stands on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking the city skyline at dusk. The golden lights shimmer below like a reflection of 1,000 stories he'll never know. He exhales deeply, the weight of pride replaced by peace. This, he murmurs, barely audible. This feels like wealth. The camera holds on him for a long moment. A man who once measured his success in numbers, now measuring it in kindness. Months have passed since that life-altering morning, and the once quiet Monroe mansion now hums with a sound it had never truly known before. Laughter. The grand dining hall, once reserved for formal banquets and sterile meetings, is now alive every afternoon with the comforting clatter of plates, soft conversation, and the aroma of home-cooked meals. Where there was once distance and hierarchy, there is now warmth and belonging. Alexander Monroe sits at the center of the long table, no longer the figure of untouchable authority, but a man at peace with his own humanity. His eyes carry a quiet contentment as he watches his staff, his team, share stories, exchange jokes, and pass dishes down the line. Charlotte Ross stands near the kitchen doorway serving the final dish, a simple bowl of homemade soup she prepared herself. But when she turns, Alexander gestures for her to join them. At first she hesitates, the habit of servitude still pulling at her instincts. But then she sees his reassuring nod. She places the ladle aside, wipes her hands on her apron, and walks toward the table. This time, there's no fear in her step. She sits among them, shoulder to shoulder with the people she once only served. Alexander smiles warmly and says, "This house isn't just mine anymore. It's ours." The room falls silent for a moment as those words sink in. Then the quiet erupts into applause and laughter, genuine, unrestrained, human. It's a moment that transcends wealth or position, a moment of shared dignity. A soft montage unfolds, Alexander and Charlotte visiting the local shelter together, boxes of food being delivered anonymously to struggling families, the staff celebrating birthdays and holidays under the same roof where once only power had a place. The marble floors that once echoed with silence now resonate with life. Kindness doesn't always begin in grand gestures. Sometimes it starts quietly, in the simple act of seeing what others have learned to ignore. Alexander saw hunger where others would have seen shame, and that vision changed everything. The camera pans across the table, faces lit by sunlight streaming through tall windows. Charlotte looks up, meeting Alexander's eyes from across the table. They share a peaceful smile, the kind that doesn't need words. He leans slightly and whispers, almost to himself, "Compassion. That's the real currency of life." The light grows warmer, wrapping the room in gold. The laughter continues, echoing softly as the image begins to fade. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, now stands as a beacon of quiet generosity. The narrator's tone turns reflective, inviting. If this story touched your heart, tell us, when was the last time you truly saw someone in need and did something to help? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story that reminds us what being human truly means.